Hello, my name's Gideon Cordova and this is my 2 cents adjusted for inflation. Currently in Australia, the economy isn't doing as well as it could be. Irrespective of whether or not the Australian stock market is up or down on a given day, we're still leaving 750,000 Australians unemployed. There's more than 1.1 million people who are currently underemployed. That means that they're not getting enough hours of paid work, or they're not employed in a job which fully utilises their skills and abilities. So how could we call ourselves efficient? How could we call ourselves in a recovered state? Unfortunately, there are now 2.9 million Australians who are living in poverty. That is, that they are living at or below the internationally accepted standards of what is considered to be the poverty line. There are 17.4% of all children in this country who are living in poverty. How could that be in one of the richest nations in the world, in certainly what is the richest time in human history, when our productive capacity, thanks to technology and thanks to our capacity to mobilise, is at its greatest ever record rate in human history, and yet we still have over 100,000 people sleeping rough, homeless, every night in this country? It's not good enough. We have to do better. So, how do we fix it? Well, some people say that a good way of spurring the economy, kind of kick-starting it, getting it to recover, is to cut company taxes. The idea here is that if you reduce the overheads that a company has to pay, then they're much more likely to hire more people. And we can extrapolate that to the kind of thinking that says if you just cut taxes on the rich, then they'll invest that money and they'll give jobs to everyone. Unfortunately, it still doesn't make complete sense when you think about it. If I owned a restaurant and I've got a full restaurant every night, all the tables are full to the brim, then I'm likely to want to hire more workers. If my restaurant is sitting empty and there's no one at any of the tables on any of the nights, then even if you give me $1 million, I'm unlikely to hire another waiter. More likely, I'll just put that $1 million in my pocket. So no matter how much of a little tax incentive carrot that you can give to businesses, they will only ever hire if there's consumer demand. That's the only time they'll put on more workers, is if there's an actual consumer demand that will necessitate those workers being employed. There's no other way around it. So how do we increase spending? Well, it can really only come from three places. Either the domestic private sector will spend more money in the Australian economy, or the foreign sector, that is all the countries overseas with whom we trade, they might spend more into our economy, or the government sector could spend more into our economy. There seems to be a lack of recognition that no matter what, capitalism relies on sales. That's the way our economic system works. Capitalism is a system that only works when there are enough customers spending enough of their money to keep sales and profits increasing. When that doesn't happen, the economy slows down. Spending creates income, income creates sales, and sales create jobs. When you have more income, you're likely to spend more of that money, and that money getting spent into the economy incentivizes business owners to put on more workers. The more money you have, the more likely you are to spend it. One of the reasons why this recession since 2008 and the global financial crisis, one of the reasons why it hasn't been as completely cataclysmic as the Great Depression of the 1920s and 30s is because we have several automatic stabilizers which are now in place which didn't exist back then. Back in the day, if you lost your job, then that was it. There was no social security, there was no welfare, there were no unemployment benefits. That was it. Your consumer spending capacity dropped to absolute zero. Nowadays, there is a floor below which consumer spending cannot drop, and that is an automatic stabilizer. So when you become unemployed, you go to the dole and you receive some pittance of an income, at least then you can spend that income on basics like food and clothing, and that puts a floor below which the consumer demand cannot drop. So that's a very important way of keeping the economy trudging along. So when the economy does slow, the government reaction to that is absolutely critical. There is an impulse that the government has to notice that when the economy is weak, then tax revenues fall as the unemployment rate rises, and there's a natural inclination or an impulse for the government to want to implement austerity measures and start cutting government spending wherever they can in order to try and rein in the deficit. But this doesn't work at all to spur the economy back to growth. As we know, the only way that the economy will kickstart growth is if there are more sales. How do you get more sales? Well, cutting government expenditure on things certainly won't help increase anybody's appetite to consume more. Now, the private sector here in Australia has been trying as hard as we can to keep spending, to maintain our standard of living. And the way that we've been doing that is by getting ourselves into greater and greater private household debt. Australian households are now one of the most highly indebted of any nation in the world. When private spending tightens, the government has to loosen its belt if it's not going to make matters worse. If both sectors, both the private and the government sector, tighten their belt at the same time, the economy will contract. So we have a situation in Australia where there are more than 1.7 million people who would want a different job or a job at all who currently can't get one. But in February, the Australian Bureau of Statistics said that there were 186,000 job vacancies being advertised. So clearly there simply aren't enough jobs for the number of job seekers that are out there. And it reminds me of a story about an island where there were 100 dogs, and every day a plane would fly over this island with 100 dogs on it and would drop 95 bones. The dogs would then fight for the bones, and each night 5 dogs went hungry. So a group of social scientists came to the island and they looked at the bonelessness problem and they said, well, we recognise that there is a rate of bonelessness that's taking place on this island. How are we going to overcome it? Well, firstly, they thought it might be a lack of motivation. The dogs simply weren't fighting hard enough to get a bone each night. And the second component of that was maybe they simply weren't trained in the really elite dog fighting, bone snatching skills. Maybe they just didn't have the training and the skill set required. So they started to educate the dogs and they started to implement all kinds of programs to motivate the dogs to want it more, give them a kick every now and then to really get them fighting for those bones. And sure enough, nothing happened. There was still the same rate of bonelessness because you can't find bones that aren't there, and you can't find jobs that aren't there. It's a game of musical chairs. No matter how well educated you become, no matter how motivated you are to not be unemployed, if there aren't enough jobs, then there will always be unemployed people. So if there's only 186,000 job vacancies per month, but over 1.7 million people who might be looking for that single set of jobs, and that doesn't take into account that some jobs are in regions where the individual job seeker isn't. On many occasions, the regional areas are disproportionately affected by joblessness. So if there are 1.7 million people looking for jobs, and each month there is only 186,000 jobs advertised, we're going to have an ongoing problem. And it's an ongoing problem that really only the government can fix. If the government does fix that, they will have to go into deficit initially in order to employ all those people. How can the government go into deficit without causing great problems for our grandkids? Well, we'll talk about that next week. My name's been Gideon Cordova. This is my 2 cents adjusted for inflation. I'll catch you next time.